Hello, fellow relationalist and relational people from Denver, Colorado. Let's have a discussion about relational governance. Just to recap the last video, because it's been a bit since I had a chance to record. Last time I talked about the inception of relationalism and what I call relational anarchy as a philosophy or an aesthetic or an ideal for creating a freer society that's a bit different from the traditional left-right paradigm of anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-communism, right? This is more of an anarchism without adjectives approach. So let's really dive into that as it pertains to what we're doing in crypto and how we're starting to think about building new governance models and structures in the form of network states or virtual self-sovereign territories. Cool. So most people right now, when they think about developing new governance models, right, or creating a network state, they're thinking in terms of what I've been calling the logical algorithm. What this means is they're thinking about the rule sets, they're thinking about the smart contracts, the contracts, the way that people think about interacting with each other in the form of the sheer logic of the thing, right? The sheer logic of the thing, which is just how to behave in a certain circumstance, right? Or in a certain way in accordance with the values of that network state or that virtual territory. And that's all important, right? That stuff is vital. You don't really have a governance structure or a functioning community without having a clear set of rules or guidelines that prescribe behavior, right? Especially behavior that is important for the functioning and the well-being of that society. However, the problem with focusing strictly on the logical algorithm is that it doesn't take into account the deeply human elements that are intrinsic to who we are as a species. And let's talk a bit about the consequences of not doing that. So if you don't take into consideration the human element when you're building a new society and you're structuring its governance, then it's possible then what you've built can turn into a cold and faceless bureaucracy. When you have a cold and faceless bureaucracy, it becomes detached from the people, and it's easy for that institution to not care about the emotionality and the humanness involved in the people. An example of that, of a faceless bureaucracy, is in the form of the drug war. When people engage in a drug trade on the market, they're just engaging in free market activity. They're not hurting anyone else, right? They're not hurting anyone. Now, when the state comes in and says that's illegal and they go to arrest those people and then put them through the criminal justice system, they very rarely actually especially from the enforcement perspective, from the cops, etc. They're just quote unquote following orders. They don't care about the human behind the problem, right? They don't care about who they're arresting, not really. Their job is just to do their job and to follow orders, right? They stop the person in the vehicle, or they kick a door down, they kidnap that person, they cage that person, and then they put them through the court system. Doesn't matter if the person has a family, doesn't matter if they get their dog shot in the process. The human there doesn't matter. There's no emotional resonance, right? There's no sense that I'm harming another human being that comes from the side of the police officer. And what I'm saying here may be controversial for some people, but this is the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in with modern governments, right? So this, just right here in this enforcement example, you can see the logical algorithm at work. You can see that this is just what is supposed to be done in accordance with the social rules that have been laid down. And the reality is they're only social rules because some dictatorial autocrat or some thug, right, who runs the system determined that these rules are just and this is the way they should be. Now, if we're thinking about including the humanistic perspective, right, the relational perspective and the emotional perspective, then before we even outline the rules, we're determining what I have just called the emotional algorithm. The emotional algorithm is when the human's at the center of everything, when human relationships are considered before the rules, right? If the human relationships are considered, if the emotional ideas are considered, then there is a judgment of how the interactions are occurring. Who is this person really? What was the motive behind what they're doing? How can I understand the human more deeply? Now, this sounds probably really abstract from a governance perspective, is what makes governance work is the rules and the structure that has been put in place by a smart contract, a constitution, or some other type of rule set that has been documented on paper or digitally. But how we would think about implementing something like the emotional algorithm is creating a constitution or a rule set that says, well, first we need to consider the human being, we need to consider the emotions, and we need to specifically consider communication. So communication is key to implementing the emotional algorithm. And one of the ways that, to make this more concrete for you, one of the ways that my friend Gabriel and I decided to do this is, like, we imagined creating a network state or developing a network state on top of, say, the Nomos blockchain consensus layer or architecture. If we created a network state, we would want to build it out thinking about the emotional algorithm, and we would do that by including a constitution that focuses on nonviolent communication, right? And this is Marshall Rosenberg's idea that I've talked about time and time again, and that I will continue to talk about. So if you build in a system that thinks about how can we solve problems and disputes first with communication and understanding other people's needs before trying to criminalize, demonize, or victimize another person, now we're understanding that they're on our wavelength as a human being. We're not above them. We're not elite in any kind of way. We're just trying to solve a problem with the human. So you develop out this emotional algorithm in any way that you see fit. Typically, this is through some type of constitution or is embedded in the rule set in some way, right, where the human is at center stage. And what this does first and foremost is it creates an environment where there's more understanding and there's more reasoning behind why people do things at the center of that social organization. It doesn't become, the point is it doesn't become cold, detached. It's just not rules for people to follow. It's not morality, and it's not economics outside of the context of the human being. So it's in a very real way focusing on the assessment of actual human needs in that particular environment. And I think this is actually even more important in the modern age, where a lot of us have a tendency to self-isolate and work on our computer and engineer and build out different protocols and tools. And the good news is a lot of these tools that we're building are really fundamental to prescribing and providing more freedom of association, more freedom for the bodily integrity, for cognitive liberty, for all these beautiful things. But at the end of the day, even that freedom needs and requires the human element. It needs and requires an understanding and an assessment of needs. In the last video, I talked about Rosenberg's idea of nonviolent communication used in tribal scenarios, right, or competing jurisdictional scenarios where there's two tribes or there's two governments that are in conflict. And how do they resolve those conflicts, right? This could happen in a network state setting where there's multiple network states, there's overlapping jurisdictions, and not everybody gets along. Your logical algorithms then are useless because your set of rules and your instructions and your understanding is different than the understanding of the other network state. It's a completely different culture potentially, even though the people are all decentralized in both. Some may live together near each other or in a similar space. So we have to figure out how to solve those problems. And you can only do that with the emotional algorithm, with ways where you can figure out how to understand common law, where you can figure out polycentric devices to solve disputes, and it only happens through understanding needs. Why is it that this group is behaving in this way? What is it that they need? How can we figure out how to work together as we continue to build our more panarchical society and develop out a multitude of network states? So this is a fundamental importance, right? Because the idea behind network states is ultimately panarchical insofar that they're non-territorial, right? People can live anywhere, but they are part of a group or a social network in the cloud. And because of this, they want to figure out how to resolve problems with others who don't agree with them. And the only way to do this, again, is having the humanistic emotional algorithm at center stage. And this is what relational governance prescribes. It is the solution to the long-standing problem of how to get people to resolve disputes without just laying down rules sort of arbitrarily for everyone to follow, right? In a sort of one-size-fits-all solution. Not a great solution, in my opinion, and it hasn't worked. Right, it's been part of the process of democracy. I mean, the reality is democracy is just mobocracy, or rule from the majority over the minority, and there's no consideration of humanness built into that. That's because it's not panarchical, so of course there's not going to be room for relationalism involved in that model. Now, there's another important aspect that we can think about in terms of how we can build out the emotional algorithm in our new network states or our new panarchic societies. And something that I really think about a lot and struck me as a vital idea comes from the economist by the name of Robin Hanson. He talked about this idea called the Dunbar number. Sorry, Robin Dunbar, not Robin Hanson. That's another economist, Robin Dunbar. So Dunbar's number suggests that the smaller or more miniaturized our communities are, the more that we can maintain healthy and adaptable relationships with our fellow human beings, right? And that number is 150. He would suggest that any community or society that starts to move beyond 150 people, the relationships get lost in that quagmire of bodies, right? There's too many people for everyone to maintain solid relationships. And the way that we can have stronger governance with the human at the center, where there's not just a lot of rampant violence and where the cold and detached bureaucracies take over, is by keeping our network states and our communities miniaturized. So automatically, to mitigate problems with the logical algorithm, we need to keep our communities small, right? This is part and parcel of the idea behind panarchy, having a multitude of different governance models in an online directory or some type of cyber directory where people can choose the type of governance they want to live under that share the same values. And that already creates deep connections and a cultural ethos and a bond that individuals there can share. But even in that environment, people can still disagree, right? We're all a heterogeneous species. We're cosmopolitan. We have a ton of different views and perspectives. And even if you share the same generalized values, which is a good start, you don't always share every single idea and concept in a similar fashion as another person does. You're not completely in lockstep ideological with that person. And that's a good thing, right? Because if we lived in a world where everyone thought exactly the same, it would be a fucking boring world, right? So we want to be in a world that has a more differentiated viewpoint and perspectives. That's one of the beautiful things about being alive. So here's the way to solve for everyone's difference of opinions and ideologies and thoughts and perspectives and idiosyncrasies. The way to do that is to keep the relationships in the societies small, keep the communities small, have a burgeoning number of different communities. And just so you guys know, there's a couple of books on this subject of miniaturization of society and keeping things small, and there's a lot of evidence to look at. So there's two books. One of them's kind of obscure. It's by an economist, Leopold Kohr, I believe is his name, and he wrote a book called, what's it called? I'm going to disremember it. I'm not going to remember it right now. I think it's called The Breakdown of Nations. The Breakdown of Nations. Check out that book. I've read most of it, but not all of it. Fantastic book. He makes a really elegant case for making the nation state super small. And this was originally, I believe, the idea behind the Federalists, right, in the U.S. They wanted to just have state power. There was not going to be not the Federalists, the other group, right, the guys who wanted to keep have no federal government, wanted to keep the system small. This is also one of the reasons why ancient Greek was so powerful and so in line with each other and grew so tremendously, is because they had the city-state or the polis model, which allowed people to share more of a similar vision, and they were able to iron out differences through the polis model and through having the agora. Everyone could come together and talk about the issues of the day. There's no surprise there of why that worked out. Now, the other book that I want to mention is a fantastic read. I don't agree with every single thing in the book, but Kirkpatrick Sell wrote a book called Human Scale Revisited. And in Human Scale Revisited, he makes the case that if we can keep all of our societies to the human scale, and he makes the case that this should happen architecturally, socially, digitally, politically. If everything is downsized, then we're automatically creating a more harmonious community and a harmonious society for us to live in. And this goes along nicely with the idea of the Dunbar number. And the overarching theme here is that all of these are pieces of this larger component called relationalism, or the emotional algorithm. The emotional algorithm is the keystone, or the mantelpiece of building a society that's not dictated by central planners, by autocrats, by kings, by tyrants, by dictators, by any of these folks who think that they should have absolute and total control over the population. Because when that happens, they're always going to try to implement just rules. The human element is not going to exist there at all. So relationalism applied to governance is called relational governance, and it's something we should really think about as technologists, as futurists, as thinkers, because we're moving into a time period where there's a lot of global strife. There's a lot of people who are concerned about the World Economic Forum and their Agenda 2030, and this idea that you will own nothing and be happy, and that you have to eat the bugs and all of this shit. The only way to start countering that is to put the fucking human back at the center of the stage. The human should be at the center of everything that we do, right? And that all that means is that we care about each other's needs. We try to assess those needs, a la Marshall Rosenberg. And if we're doing that, and we have a governance model behind that does have the rules, that has the logical infrastructure, then we have all the pieces of the puzzle complete. It's really a shame that we are a deeply amygdalic, that is an emotional species, but we haven't fully applied that emotional thinking to our societies. And the reason that is because I think in Western society, especially after the Enlightenment, after Enlightenment ideals came to the forefront, the idea that emotion was important was pushed downward, right? Emotions were shunned as volatile, as irrational, as non-thinking, as unimportant. But the reality is that if we're to come together in harmony and grow as a species and live in a largely globalized world, then we have to learn to get along with each other. You know, this is the cosmopolitan spirit. We have to figure out how to do that. And the way to do that is to both continue growing globally, of course, but we also have to fragmentize our societies into different types of network states, right? And these states can essentially have any type of functionality that you want them to have, right? They can have a ruler, right? But another one may have no ruler at all. It may be completely anarchistic, right? And these are kind of, I mentioned the phrase prefigurative apolitics last time. These are just like base layers, right? Or sorry, these are secondary layers in society, because there's some society or there's some community or network state that's been created on top of some type of consensus layer or blockchain, right? So the point here is that even if you have a dictatorial network state, that's understood, and the people who are there understand that they're being ruled over. It's all part of it. It's all transparent. But even above that, those guys have to realize that everyone else in the world has a different understanding, they have a different attitude, they have different values, and their values can be completely antithetical. If they're emotionally attuned, yes, they can have that type of environment, and it's understandable, and they're living purposely by that design, but now they can leverage relational tactics and relational understanding to get along with other network states. So everyone can kind of have their cake and eat it too under the relational model. And I'm really happy to be here talking about these ideas. I think they're paramount because I don't think a lot of people are actually discussing this stuff. We're out there just building as fast as we can build, right? We're developing AI, we're developing network states, we're developing new blockchain tools, we're dabbling in Web3, all kinds of shit, and everyone's just building as fast as they can build. But we need to take a step back and figure out how we're going to implement all of this shit in a world that is increasingly changing, and that the ideas that have come to fruition in psychology and cognitive science over the course of the last few decades have not really been considered and integrated into what we're doing in tech. So it's my goal and my design to try to figure out how we can bring ideas in cognitive neuroscience, especially around ideas around mirror neurons, human connectivity, the amygdalic structures, the problems that we all have with dealing with trauma and the consequences of that, how we can bring all of this together and to bear to build into our society in a very forward-facing way that's understandable and that's palatable for everyone. I know that I rambled a lot, or I got to talking a lot, guys. There's a ton of information here, and I'm really still learning about all of this stuff myself. I think it's of vital importance. Again, I can't say that enough, because if we're not thinking about how to actually get along with each other as we're building these new societies and as we're destabilizing the legacy systems, we're going to end up back in the same place where we started. It doesn't matter if we create these new structures and societies. It's not a de facto answer to the problems of our times. It's just one of the solutions, one of the ways that we can begin. So anyway, I have a lot more to say. I think I want to discuss a bit more about this idea of a cold, detached bureaucracy and how we can solve for that in the next video. I also am keen to get a bit more into some details about some of the psychology, some of its history, and how it applies to these ideas. So humanistic psychology is tremendously important. I think behavioral economics also plays into what we're doing. Neurophysiology, also psychedelics. I could talk a ton about that, and we need to have that discussion in terms of building these new network states and implementing relational governance. Cool. All right, guys, until the next video, much love to all my Logos people, to all my cult people that are out there. You guys are part and parcel of this revolution, this evolution that we are creating, and it's absolutely beautiful. If you like this video, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or follow me on X, please. All right, cheers, guys.